Hello, my name is Olorotimiosha. Today is July the 29th, 2026, and it's been over a week since the release of Christopher Nolan's Hollywood remaking of uh, Homer's epic, The Odyssey. Just yesterday, I was watching a podcast by a Greek classicist who was basically excoriating Christopher Nolan's version of the Odyssey, accusing him of being disrespectful to Greek civilization or to Homer and whatnot. And I've read a few articles like that as well. Some classicists have said, well, they're rather amused. On the whole, I think I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen clips of it and I've read lots of reviews, lots of podcasts discussing it. Some of these podcasts show clips and they analyze and they've talked about uh, where he made, where he diverged from the book. And I've done videos explaining some of these uh, deviations from the book. I've read two translations of Homer's The Odyssey. In particular, I liked E.V. Rowe. So again, yes, when I from the clips I've seen and just from the way Nolan characterized the epic, I mean the way he portrayed it, it's obvious that he's telling an American story, an anti-war story that's very American, distinctly American, very modern, talking about PTSD. He's talking about a modern society that's agnostic, and he's relegated the anthropomorphism that's consistent, very prominent, very salient in Greek poems, especially in Homer's poems. He's relegated to mere superstition and false beliefs. So he's made the gods, harmless, and the Greeks. I mean, the Greek classicists that I've watched who've criticized Nolan have said that he diminished Odysseus, right? Because Odysseus is supposed to characterize, that's one of those huge elements of Greek zeitgeist. That's cunning intelligence, or you call it métier, right? Métier, uh, right? So Homer's The Odyssey captures or incorporates all of the main elements of Greek zeitgeist, and that's cunning intelligence, or you call it métier, xenia, or hospitality. They keep referencing hospitality, Zeus's law of hospitality in the movie, and of course, nostos, or homecoming, and reclaiming one's identity in their homeland, their original homeland. In the end, Odysseus goes on exile, self-exile, so he's not restored to his homeland because he goes on exile. So he's reimagined Homer, so that's a major piece of experimentation. But something I find interesting is, yes, there have been a lot of Hollywood retellings of the Odyssey. I've watched Kirk Douglas's Ulysses. Kirk Douglas starred as Ulysses. Remember, I've done videos explaining that the Romans who conquered the Greeks but admired the Greeks, right? They made they Latinized everything Greek, so they had their own version, and the translations of Roman gods, Roman epics, right, in Latin. So in Roman, the Greek Odysseus is called Ulysses. Same story. Uh, the Greek uh, the Greek gods are given Roman names, right? So Zeus is Jupiter. Poseidon in Greek is Neptune in Roman, right? Aphrodite in Greek is Venus in Latin or Roman. Like Latin and Roman, they're the same, right? Um, Athena, who was Odysseus's patron god, is Minerva in Latin, right? And it goes on and on. And so Odysseus is Ulysses. So interestingly, like I said, Hollywood did do, a remake titled Ulysses, starring Kirk Douglas, but it's very consistent, almost exactly true to the story. It leaves out some parts, but it doesn't modify or adapt or, experiment, or alter stories like Nolan does. Nolan completely alters a lot of things, and he tells a different story. It's clear Nolan has written, has directed an anti-war epic. He's just used Homer's characters and story of the Odyssey, right? And he's describing PTSD instead of the manipulation, the salient manipulation of the Greek gods that Homer had depicted in the Odyssey, right? 3,000 years ago. So, but prior to these Hollywood versions, right, there was an artist, very famous author, of course, that's James Joyce, Irishman. Most readers know James Joyce. He wrote, he portrayed Homer's book in his own piece of experimentation, and he titled it Ulysses. So when you see Ulysses, you think that he's writing about Homer, right? Homer's The Odyssey. You think that's what it's about. So I've read the book. It has nothing to do with it. So it's a huge piece of experimentation. James Joyce released it in 1922. I've read it, but it's a piece of experimentation, and interestingly, the world calls it one of the a masterpiece in modernist literature, right? So modernism was a literary or artistic movement in the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, right? And there was modernism in art. People know of Jackson Pollock, for instance, and it was a period of experimentation, and basically artists were trying to break from tradition, right? The traditional ways of representation, right? So it was a period of experimentation and just a departure from conventional art forms. Picasso was a modernist artist, so you see the way Picasso, draws his objects and things like that. So it was idealistic, very experimentational, and again, importantly, it was sort of supposed to be natural, impulsive, and it was just a departure from, in literature, a departure from a linear narrative, right? And so that was what James Joyce's Ulysses was. And James Joyce's Ulysses, interestingly, like I said, I've read it. My thought was, as I was reading, is that, hey, how come nobody thought this guy was crazy and belonged in a mental institution? Apparently, people did say that. People thought he was mad, right? Because it's disorganized. It doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have your typical narrative. It was banned in the United States, right, for obscenity. It was banned in the UK for obscenity. It was ignored. It was not even noticed amongst the Greeks, right? So the Greeks today have noticed Christopher Nolan's Hollywood, The Odyssey, and they're up in arms, clutching their pearls. In fact, there's a Greek person who, because I've been doing videos and posting them on my social media, there's an elderly Greek man who responded to one of my posts, and he was very, he was censorious. He was rather, he was very critical, right? He was very critical of the translations, and that whoever hasn't read the actual Greek can understand it. But what he didn't understand was Christopher Nolan. Obviously, he's read the Odyssey, at least translations of it, but he decided to tell his own story. He's just using Homer's characters and Homer's title, the same thing that James Joyce did. James Joyce, interestingly, while I thought, hey, are we sure that James Joyce is not crazy? When I was reading his his um, his story, his book, I think it was over 600 pages, and it's just this disorganized, irrational. In modernism, they came to call it stream of consciousness, right? And he did things. I mentioned how it was actually banned in the United States, and the UK was censored because of obscenity. So James Joyce did something. It's the Victorian, because this was in the wake of Victorian literature, right? Victorians like Charles Dickens, whom I admire, Wilkie Collins, and and people like that. George Sand, so many of these other people, right? George Eliot, and on and on. He he would do things that typical writers don't do. James Joyce actually described someone, that was Leopold Bloom, using the toilet. He described him using the toilet, sitting down. He used this comic onomatopoeia, right? That's what it's called, to describe someone passing gas. That was Leopold Bloom. As he was passing gas, there was a period that he timed his flatulence, his farting, or excuse the word, with the passing of a tram, and then he uses the word. He actually describes it, PRF, proof. The sound flatulence makes when you're passing gas. So James Joyce does all these things that are unusual, right? You won't hear, for instance, even in modern times, right? Bourne, I like to read the Bourne series, or anybody writing about a character, right? Of course, you're going through their daily lives. They don't write about them using the bathroom, them passing gas. Obviously, people do these things. Nobody writes about those things. But James Joyce actually does this stuff, right? And so when I read James Joyce's Ulysses, I had to go and read his biography to see, okay, was this guy crazy? Why? How come people thought this was brilliant? Because I didn't get it. He wrote an entire page without the use of punctuation marks. Instead, the world was praising him. Of course, there were people who thought he was mad, but psychiatrists at the time thought he wasn't. They said no, that he's demonstrated an extreme form of genius, right? But some people, historians, also point out that, look, because he did sleep with prostitutes at the time. He did live the sort of life that could have exposed him um, to syphilis. In fact, there was speculation that he probably had syphilis. And syphilis, the advanced stage, it leads to madness, dementia. People know of Al Capone, right, who died of syphilis, right? People who have syphilis, they go crazy, right, eventually. But they said he showed that there were symptoms he showed that could have been, signs of syphilis, but he never actually showed the advanced dementia, never showed any sign of that advanced neuro degeneration that syphilis would lead to, right, would result in. So he never showed any of those things. But he had persistent eye trouble, and so he had to have surgery for his eyes. And they said eye trouble can be a sign of syphilis. And then he had abscess from his mouth. At some point, I think he lost all his teeth or something. He lost a lot of teeth, and so he struggled with all of those things. But that was just from poverty, right? He was poverty's poor living conditions and things like that. Regarding mental illness, they mentioned that his daughter or something, his child, did suffer from schizophrenia. So it's possible. I don't know. But I thought the writing was so bizarre. There are things there were things he would write on and describe certain things, and you'd say, okay, this guy is very clever. The person who's writing this is very clever, right? But again, the whole writing was disorganized. But again, it was a period of modernism, and that was what modernism was about. If you see Jackson Pollock's art, it just splashed stuff, and so that was the movement, and I guess that was what um, uh, James Joyce was doing with Ulysses. It's interesting, you know, but again, they say no, that there's no hard proof that he did have a mental illness or suffered syphilis, even though he was using arsenic and injections of arsenic and phosphorus, which they said is actually used to treat, was a treatment back then for syphilis, right? So those are suggestion that he might have had, syphilis and some kind of neurodegenerative illness or whatever. But again, the psychiatrists of the time said, well, and later psychiatrists and historians say that he was just demonstrating a very advanced form of genius, right? Hey, but interestingly though, the Greeks did not notice. They took no notice at all of his publication of Ulysses, right? So it was released in relative obscurity at the time amongst the Greeks, other than it being banned in the United States and the UK. But Christopher Nolan, of course, he had there was a lot of controversy even prior to its release, and on its release, it's been a blockbuster, tremendous financial success, made over $666 million in just a week, and certainly surpassed its $250 million budget in just a week. But I just thought I should point that out, that he's Christopher Nolan's, received a very significant and perhaps unfair amount of censure for having diminished Greek Greek culture, Greek civilization, as they put it. But James Joyce doesn't get the same backlash, right? Even though you know his writing showed all this experimentation and obscenity, in the name of Homer's character, right, Ulysses, and a major work actually describing how somebody's using an outhouse, like using the toilet, sitting down, taking a dump, the the farting in public, and things like that, just grotesque stuff that writers don't typically describe. Writers don't do that. They don't describe that while they're writing. And it's certainly not Victorian literature, right? They wouldn't describe all those obscene, vulgar stuff, right? But anyway, I thought I should just mention this. My name is Olurotimi, and I'll do more videos describing um, Homer's epic, The Odyssey. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.